Hi, so this week I had a comment from someone on one of my videos saying that when it comes to dungeons, they'd much prefer it if Blizzard made very difficult dungeons without the time constraint. And they used as an example the heroic dungeons as they were in TBC. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is how the dungeons were at those times and why it is that something like that wouldn't be the same if it were introduced now, because technically it already is. So when it came to the heroic dungeons in TBC, they certainly had a fearsome reputation, and for some of those dungeons, deservedly so. All you had to do is to say, oh, does anyone fancy Shadow Labs? And you have never seen guild chat go so quiet so quickly. You actually had to physically whisper people so that they had to deny you. No one was going to be volunteering for that shit show. It was a very long dungeon. There were a lot of nightmare parts of it, and it was very, very tough. There was a similar situation in Shattered Halls, for example, particularly when you came to the sort of what were they, like legionnaires that were practicing with each other, and you'd pull them a bit at a time, and you'd wait for them to knock their own health down quite low, then pull them because they were quite brutal. There were a lot of very unpleasant situations in those dungeons. But ultimately what made them very, very tough was not the encounters. I think the encounters that we have in the dungeons we have now potentially can be just like that at the mythic level. Where we have a difference is that at the time when you'd freshly dinged in TBC and you were getting yourself ready to do those heroic dungeons, you had your quest gear. And you'd be getting blue gear. Your only source of epic gear was the dungeons at the end, or the bosses, sorry, at the end of the heroic dungeons. And most of that stuff wasn't that great. The reason why I use Shadow Labs, first of all, as the example, is that Murmur, is that what it's called? Something like that. At the end of it, dropped a shockwave hammer or something, a healing hammer. It wasn't that great. But, at the time, it was decent enough. But ultimately, what you'd want to do is to get your epics as a raider from Karazhan. You'd be getting yourself into Karazhan. That's really where you'd be getting most of your gear. You'd have got the odd little piece from there. You'd have got the odd little piece from PvP, but that wouldn't be epic gear. That'd be blue gear in terms of what you could get quickly. Nowadays, you get epic gear instantly. As soon as you get to level cap, you can, if you've got some gold, go to the auction house. People will have found some BOEs, epic BOEs. You can buy some of those. You can even craft some fairly quickly. It doesn't take very long before you're even doing raiding for the mythic dungeons to come out, where you're straight away getting epic gear there. So it doesn't take very long before you can get quite a lot of gear, to the point where, in theory, you can give yourself an extremely difficult, challenging dungeon experience where the timer isn't an issue. If you're going to try and complete, for example, a plus 15 or whatever would be high for your group, where you can't possibly beat the timer, and it's all about, can you actually just beat the dungeon in whatever time, even if it takes you several hours, you can sort of have that experience. But ultimately, the timer has got to be an important part of it, I think, for two reasons. One, as I say, the gear means that if that timer wasn't there and you just automatically upgraded your key every time you got to the end of it, as long as you did finish it, and maybe you always got +1 and you could get +2 or +3 if you did beat it within a certain amount of time, people would end up pushing them much, much higher than they do now. And I think that would be much less enjoyable. It'd be much more repetitive, because you'd be having to do more and more dungeons each week, because you'd push higher and higher as your gear got better. The other reason, of course, I think we know why the timer has to be in there, because it makes it particularly suitable for the MDIs. It makes it very suitable for use as an esport, watching it if there's a set amount of time. Much like traditional sports have a set amount of field time, so that everyone knows what to expect in terms of how long it may reasonably take. So that's probably part of it as well. But I think the greater part of it is just simply that just the way we play the game now. Now, the only other alternative that would occur to me as being one potential way to do it is if they were to design a special set of dungeons very much along the same lines as you would design raid encounters. That these encounters are designed to be incredibly tough and the sort of things that only a very small number of the best players would be able to complete quickly. In other words, there'd be actual progress going on in a dungeon. Now, that, would satisfy that condition. And I don't say that would be a bad piece of content for the developers to do. I don't think they will do it. I think there's a number of reasons why not. Several weeks is not ridiculous. The problem is how many people would actually be interested in it. So you'd get into the whole thorny territory of how many people would be accessing that content. It wouldn't be of interest from the point of view of esports, so it wouldn't help Blizzard with that, because raids are not very. Some people, I suppose, will watch it. But I don't find raids particularly good from a spectator's point of view. Nowhere near as good as a timed run in a dungeon. Even when they've sort of done those races at BlizzCon between top guilds for raids, it's like, it's not actually very interesting, is it? I don't think so. And then the other big problem with that, as I say, is the amount of development time it would take to do that. And the fact that there's trash in there. Now, in a raid, all right, sometimes trash is actually quite nasty. But mostly it's there just to slow you down to give your loot master time to distribute the loot. Even though it's now forced personal loot. Ironically, your loot master takes even longer over it now, I imagine. It's a much worse situation. But that's really what trash exists for. It's just there to pad out the raid. Because really what you're doing is doing bosses. In a dungeon, a trash is very much a key feature of it. Sometimes more so than the bosses. It all depends. I mean, you got fortified. The trash is much more important than the bosses usually. So what would you do about that from a progress point of view? Are you going to create trash where you need to progress through it? It actually almost puts me in mind of Naxxramas. So Anchorage, for a certain extent, there was trash in Anchorage, AQ40, that is the raid version, the big raid version. That sometimes took a little bit of practice to perfect. Although I wouldn't really call it progress on there. But in Naxxramas, there was certainly some trash that needed an awful lot of coordination to set up and deal with. But I don't think people would really like the feel of having to progress on trash. On a boss, yes. So, yeah, what I would say is, when it comes to the Mythic Plus Dungeon, if they were to just remove the timer and just, if you complete it, you upgrade your key, I would say the problem with that, as I said, is people are just going to have to do more and more dungeons to push themselves up to the highest level they can get, and that might lose a little bit of the shine for some people, a bit too repetitive. If they were to design whole new dungeons or versions of the same dungeons with new mechanics deliberately to make it progress orientated, very much like raids, it would serve a much smaller number of people. It wouldn't be as good from a spectator point of view, and your problem would be, again, with trash. What do you do? Because it's such a core feature of dungeons. I don't think you could get away in the same way you can with a raid of just having trash being there for slowing down purposes. It's such a crucial part of the whole experience. So that's why I don't think it's terribly realistic. And going back to the idea of it being like in TBC, I think the dungeons we've got now, mechanically speaking, are absolutely on the same level as the TBC ones. It's just that we get geared up so quickly now that the only way to distinguish us is to be able to push higher and higher keys. But what does give it the real interest is the affixes. In fact, I would say that the way dungeons are now are much more interesting mechanically and challenging as a result of those affixes. This week, for example, we had much less trouble in my casual group because we had Teeming Volcanic. I think they're the two easiest middle affixes you can get For me personally, they're the ones that worry me the least. Whereas next week they might be horrendous, and then we struggle again. So I think the system now is pretty good. But anyway, those are my thoughts. That's my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share with other people who may also be interested. And until next time, I'll see you later.